Okay, folks, I know that we're expecting more people that registered to come in, and I'm sure they will shortly, but I'd like to get us started since we're 1 minute past 12. Thank you everyone for joining us. For those who don't know who I am, my name is Seepan Parseghian. I'm the chair of the Houston Bar Association International Law Section and an attorney at Beck Redden here in Houston, Texas. Today we're all here for the event U.S. Elections and International Law, a survey of key trends and issues. And I am very honored to have with us as our guest today, Professor Harold Hongju Koh, who is the Sterling Professor of International Law at Yale Law School. And I'll give a short version of his incredibly accomplished and long bio. And he returned to Yale Law School in January of 2013 after serving for nearly 4 years as the 22nd legal advisor to the US State Department under President Obama. Professor Koh is one of the country's leading experts in a variety of fields related to international law, including public and private international law, national security law, and human rights. He first began teaching at Yale Law School in 1985 and served as the Yale Law School's dean from 2004 until 2009. From 2009 to 2013, when he joined the State Department as legal advisor, as I said earlier, and that was service for which he received the Secretary of State's Distinguished Service Award. From 1993 to 2009, he was the Gerard C. and Bernice Latrobe Smith Professor of International Law at Yale Law School. And from 1998 to 2001, he served as U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Professor Koh has received 17 honorary degrees and more than 30 awards for his human rights work. And I won't go and list them all, but some of them include awards from Columbia Law School and the American Bar Association for his lifetime achievements in international law. He has authored or co-authored 8 books, including, I believe most recently in 2018, a book about the Trump administration and international law, which I will have a question or two about when we get into the discussion. He has published more than 200 articles, testified regularly before Congress, and litigated numerous cases involving international law issues in both US and international tribunals, most recently including representation of the country of Ukraine in some disputes against the Russian Federation. He is a fellow of the American Philosophical Society and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, an honorary fellow of Magdalen College, Oxford, and a member of the Council of the American Law Institute. Also relevant for our section, I believe, Professor Koh, please correct me if I'm wrong, but you also serve as on the board of directors of the American Arbitration Association. So Professor Koh holds a bachelor's degree from Harvard College and bachelor's and master's degrees from Oxford, where he was a Marshall Scholar. He earned his JD from Harvard Law School, where he was the developments editor of the Harvard Law Review. And before joining Yale as a professor, he served as a law clerk for Justice Harry Blackmun of the United States Supreme Court and Judge Malcolm Richard Wilkie of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. He worked as an attorney in private practice in Washington, D.C., and served as an attorney advisor for the Office of Legal Counsel at the U.S. Department of Justice. So with that, I'd like to begin, Professor Koh, with a topic that's surely on everybody's minds today, which are the riots and insurrection at the U.S. Capitol last week and the resulting fallout from those events. There's been a lot of discussion, dissection, diagnosis about the impact of the riots on the state of American democracy, Trump's next moves, the domestic politics in this country post-Trump, and Americans standing on the global stage. So my first question to you, what were your thoughts as you watched the events of the last week unfolding?
Well, I think I experienced the same horror that all of you did. It was shocking to see how much our democracy has been debased, and that it was a reminder of how much work is yet to be done by the Biden administration. And I think that everybody is counting down the days, but Trump is only part of the problem. There's a general disrespect for the rule of law, which we've all pledged to serve. And to this day, some people are justifying it. I mean, this is quite shocking. I was watching the second impeachment proceedings earlier today. You know, here's someone who incited people to go to the Capitol where they tried to kill his own vice president. And a lot of the congressmen want to just sort of sweep it under the rug. This is ordinary business. And I think what that shows you is how numbed we've been by the last 4 years. Something like the call that was made to the Georgia Secretary of State only a couple of days earlier would have been just a mind-blowing thing. Compare that to the Richard Nixon 18-minute tape. Instead, nobody's talking about that. And we have a president who yesterday said it's entirely appropriate. 350,000 people are dead from coronavirus through demonstrable incompetence, and nobody's discussing that. So I think it's quite a time. It's a big challenge ahead, and I think that bar associations and lawyers will play a huge part in, have played a huge part in holding the guardrails, and will play a huge part in digging us out of the hole we're in.
And I'll get to that point in a minute, which I think is a very important point, and especially for our members here today. But before we get to that, what impact, tying this back to international law, what impact do you think those riots have on the U.S. in the international arena?
I think it's devastating. I think that over the last 4 years, they've come to see, a lot of our closest allies and our adversaries have come to see the U.S. as a fallen idol. I think they seriously question the competence of the United States. Why should they, why should South Korea, with almost no coronavirus deaths, blindly follow a country which cannot contain the coronavirus? And so a loss of faith that we have, both for our intentions and our achievements. And it's going to take more for Biden than simply saying we're going to build back better. He's going to actually have to do it. It's a process of confidence building that I think will take really probably all of the first term.
Do you think that these riots were somewhat of a nail in the coffin for America's role as a beacon of democracy and rule of law promotion around the world, or do you think there's a way to restoring that role for America?
I hope it's not a nail in the coffin, Seepan. I came to, my family came to this country and saw it as a great beacon. America has two faces. When Americans are right and doing things well, others admire them and want to follow them. I remember the day after Obama got elected, I was at a meeting in Europe on behalf of not the day he got elected, but about a year later, he was the president at that point, and I was his emissary to this meeting. And a bunch of people I had known before from my last time in the government were coming up to me, and every one of them had almost the same theme, which was, we usually don't think America is a more open place than our country, but when something like Obama getting elected president happens, it reminds us that we're wrong. That, my dad was ambassador from Korea to the United States in the 60s. And I was sitting at a meeting at the UN in Geneva, and I was having dinner with this guy from an ambassador from another country. And I told him that story. And he said, "You mean you went from being your father was the ambassador to the United States and you're ambassador from the United States in one generation?" And he said, "That could never happen in our country. It couldn't happen anywhere else in the world." And he said, that's why the United States is the greatest nation on earth. And he said this very sincerely. So I think there's a lot of respect and frankly hope that the United States can get its act together again. It certainly shakes their confidence that we would elect somebody like Trump. I think it's shaking their confidence even more that he seems to have his grip on a very significant part of the population. So I think there's a lot of repair work to do.
And what role, you mentioned bar associations earlier, what role do you see bar associations playing in that repair work going forward?
Yeah, so we have an interesting phenomenon here. We never before had a president who had absolutely no respect for the rule of law, zero. Um, we thought Richard Nixon had was the bottom of the barrel, but Richard Nixon had the decency to resign when he had lost political support. But Trump has shown contempt for all of the institutions that underpin the rule of law, that free and fair elections, peaceful transfer of power, independent judiciary, independent media, respect for the civil service, the intelligence units, prosecutions on a non-political basis, pardons without favor to cronies, protections for immigrants, racial, religious, and sexual minorities. There is literally no area where he has not shown contempt for the rule of law. And as international lawyers, those in the section know that reliable rules of international law, when they're internalized into national law, give other people the assurance that their investments and their activities will be protected when they're operating abroad. So I think Trump has had a devastating impact on investor confidence. It turns on reliability, stability of regulation, protection of settled expectations, preservation of like outcomes for like cases, and most fundamentally, due process of law. And in the environment in which we were operating, none of those things was assured. And I think that that's devastating. And again, just a normal course of business will be a huge economic boost, because people can have some assurances again about the way things are being done.
So, and I think that is a good segue to my next question, which is, and this leads to, the book that you wrote in 2018 titled The Trump Administration and International Law. And I promise you remember that Professor.
It's not showing. It's not showing. That's fine. That's fine.
Zoom isn't allowing you to plug the book.
I'm being blocked. I'm being blocked just like Trump. Yeah.
That's fine. Well, so the title is The Trump Administration and International Law, and you wrote it in 2018. And so for those of us who have not read the book, and I guess this would be, if you could share a synopsis of that book and what your thoughts are on the Trump administration's relationship with international law, especially as compared to his predecessors. And I think you've already touched on this, at least in the domestic context, and I'm sure your perspective is similar internationally, but if you could please elucidate on that a bit.
Yeah, I wrote it starting his first year of his presidency into the second year of his presidency. And so it was very much a mid-first term assessment. What I argued in lay terms was that it was very clear that Trump had a very different philosophy that was antithetical to the way that internationalist administrations of both parties, whether Clinton or George H.W. Bush, had operated. And nevertheless, there was a legal process and institutions operating, and institutions that would resist and try to maintain the guardrails. And so I analogized it to the famous rumble in the jungle where Muhammad Ali lay on the ropes like this and let George Foreman pound him until he was so exhausted, and then he came off the ropes and he knocked him out. And I predicted that these guardrails would hold even if battered and bruised, which they have, I think, and that Trump would be knocked out at a minimum by defeat in the midterm election. After 4 years, and that did happen. I think that three things I did not predict. First, I didn't predict that Trump had absolutely no internal compass. I thought that there would be some point where he would reach some limit of shame, but I was wrong on that. In fact, I blame myself. I should have thought of that. Secondly, I didn't think that his party would be such enablers, or that somehow they would see his activity is helpful to their own agenda. And that comes all the way through to denying a free and fair election, which is what Cruz and Hawley have done. And third, I thought that the Mueller report would be more definitive. And, you know, as you see from the various internal memoirs, you know, there's a lot of internal debate within the Mueller team. Andrew Weissman, who's someone I work with in the government, said that a lot of people were encouraging Mueller to be more proactive. And so I think that that was a missed opportunity. And certainly the first impeachment was a missed opportunity. You know, the idea that you can be helped by foreign interference with an election and then try to solicit foreign interference in your next election, your re-election, is pretty shocking. And I never would have thought somebody could get away with that with only one member of his own party, Mitt Romney, voting for the impeachment. So I think things have changed. Things are much more polarized. I think I was writing a book that was assuming that there would be more of a semblance of normal politics. In the last week, you know, it turns out it takes being attacked in your own space for members of Congress to wake up. I mean, and as you see the further videos that's playing out, it's very clear that they were really in jeopardy. Pelosi, Pence, Schumer, you know, if various Capitol Police didn't function in heroic ways, they could have been, you know, literally taken hostage or lynched or any other kinds of things. So this is an amazing and shocking spectacle for the world's greatest constitutional democracy.
Well, on that sobering note, you did bring up the issue of election interference, and I did want to ask you about a statement, the so-called Oxford statement that you co-drafted and co-signed along with over 130 other international law experts, I believe back in October of 2020, alerting the U.S. and essentially the world as to the insecure electoral processes that we have in the United States as a result of foreign interference, and more, I think equally importantly, the international legal rules that would help secure the elections in the United States. And so if you could elaborate on that a bit as to what those international rules are and how you assess now that the election's over, how the elections went.
So thanks for asking about that, Seepan. We actually started this Oxford process. This is part of the private sector creating its own guardrails. I was having conversation with a number of other well-known international lawyers, and we agreed, look, everybody agrees that you cannot use cyber intrusion to attack a hospital during COVID. You know, like if somebody messes with a computer and turns off all the ventilators, everybody's going to die. But it turned out that it wasn't clear where under international law it said that. And different people had arguments based on the law of war, based on human rights law, based on public international law. So we got this group of experts together. This is all during the pandemic. And we did a first Oxford statement about digital protections for the healthcare sector. Then a couple of months later, it became clear that if we could get 150 signatures on this, and remember that under Article 38 of the Statute of the International Court of Justice, statements by publicists are a subsidiary source of international law, that we could try to do a second kind of statement about the immunity of vaccine research from this kind of digital tampering. Because after all, if everybody's waiting for a vaccine, it's critically important that you say that it's a no-fly zone. That's what these Oxford statements are about, is declaring international legal no-fly zones. And then the third was on the election. And we found that a little bit more complex because there are two aspects of this. One is actual cyber interference through digital means. You know, for example, everybody would agree that telling people that the election is going to be held on a different day, or adjusting things in the computer so that people the vote that they're casting is not going to the person they want to vote for is per se interference. The more complicated part is disinformation, lying, because of differences in European and US approaches to information that can be spread on online media. And, you know, obviously the Europeans are very tough on hate speech, very tough on incitement to violence, the US less so. And in fact, that is exactly where we're at now, is that, you know, it finally got to the point that a few days ago, social media, big time social media, barred Trump from doing what he's been building up to all along. So there are a couple different reactions to that. One is, you know, why is it that Mark Zuckerberg is making this kind of decision, but our own constitutional decision makers can't disempower the president by using the 25th Amendment, by using the impeachment process, or by using the 14th Amendment, Section 3. You know, so I'm glad that Zuckerberg and other Twitter and others have essentially cut off Trump's megaphone, but it should have happened a lot sooner. But I think it further illustrates the need for clearly stated protections. You know, it turns out that we tried to make these Oxford statements as simple as possible so they could be understood by average people. And interestingly, I think we could point out that there wasn't that much foreign electoral interference in the elections that occurred. Look at what was said by the guy from Homeland Security who Trump then fired. The real problem with the election was domestic attempts at electoral interference by our own president, you know, and it didn't happen as actively, or it wasn't as visible before, but it certainly was incredibly visible after the fact. And when the president brings 60 lawsuits, loses all of them, and then engages in direct coercion of officials from his own party and impliedly subjecting them to threats, that's much worse than Richard Nixon ever did. And by the way, you know, he pretty much got away with that. And then people are surprised when the next step is people storm the Capitol. And it's nice to see that there are limits. You know, Mike Pence, I think, draws a line when people are trying to kill Mike Pence. But you might want that to happen earlier. You know, Mitch McConnell has clearly made a calculation that, you know, he wants to liberate his party from Trump. Why he didn't make that determination earlier shows how he does his calculations. And then the fact that people like your senator down there, Ted Cruz or Josh Hawley, are still pressing this line is really appalling. You know, these guys have no business in public service.
You did touch on something earlier, which was the reaction of social media to this entire chain of events, and which ultimately led to banning Trump's accounts. And I think in general, there's something to say for social media in international law catching, at least international law catching up with the age of social media. I know that, you know, in recent years, there's been case law in various international tribunals that now recognize incitement to violence through social media as evidence of crimes against humanity, or could be considered in cases of genocide and various other atrocities. And so I think this is just part of that, perhaps that same trend where international law and you know, even companies themselves are now catching up to what can happen through social media. And so, you know.
Well, private actors are definitely bear responsibilities. As Seepan knows, he was at the Rwanda tribunal. One of their most famous cases was about Radio Mil Colleen.
That's right.
And whether they could call for genocide of, quote, cockroaches. And that was a case where freedom of expression bumped up against war crimes law, and war crimes law won. Right. But I think also the extent to which this social media, yeah, I mean, what a peaceful few days we've had without Trump tweeting every 5 minutes, and it's been it's a very welcome change. But I think that the whole point is that social media can really be harnessed with deep fakes and other things for systematic attacks on the truth, creation of alternative realities for people like QAnon, for inciting people to violence, and creating a sense of false understanding. I think one of the points which was very striking to me listening to one of the people who attacked the Capitol on TV is that they sort of assumed that they could just walk up to the Capitol, walk in, and that they would stop counting the votes and Trump would be declared the president. I mean, they were living in a world in which all they were reading were like-minded accounts that, deeply disconnected them from the reality of what was going to happen. And it turns out we're now at 5 deaths, and who knows if we counted them all.
Well, we've certainly been critical of President Trump so far in this discussion, Professor Koh, and I do want to ask you a question, again, with his relationship with international law, and to frame it this way. So as we know, Trump has pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Accords, World Health Organization, and weakened multilateral alliances such as NATO. On the other hand, our members recently heard from the Director of International Affairs and Trade from the city of Houston. His name is Christopher Olson. And I posed a question to him about what his experience has been with the implementation of the USMCA, which Trump pushed through. And his insight was that it was actually a welcome change and it was a modernization of NAFTA. And so far had been something that, was working for the city of Houston, especially with Mexico and Canada being two of its largest trade partners. So that, made me think of the question to pose to you, which is, can you point to areas in which the Trump administration has succeeded in promoting and developing international law?
Well, I think I would qualify the example of the USMCA by pointing out that many of the provisions that have made it better were actually prepared for the TTP, which which Trump pulled out of, and then was desperate then to get a modification of the NAFTA, and he didn't put much care what it was. And so the very things that he had rejected in one setting got put in the other setting. That's why I think it's made it better. I think, Seepan, you pointed to the thing that you could argue is, like, if you have agreements that are outmoded and there's not easy to revise them, pulling out creates a situation where if you go back in, as Biden will now do, you can negotiate for some changes. I think the Iran nuclear deal it'll be hard to get back into the deal. I think that there are some revisions because time has moved on. I think one thing I would flag is the use of targeted sanctions against human rights violators under the Magnitsky Act. But ironically, that's not Trump's doing, it's Congress's doing. Against Russia, Trump, of course, refused to ever criticize Putin in a way that made people extremely suspicious. And as a result, Congress imposed a lot of sanctions, which then allowed Trump to say, nobody's been tougher on Russia than I have. He was really saying that because I didn't do anything, Russia was very tough on them. And some of the laws got passed because our allies pushed for it. When the Russians were poisoning people in England,
right?
After Theresa May went to Trump and said, we have to have some kind of action. So the Magnitsky Act and the Magnitsky sanctions, I think, has proven to be an effective device. And I think that could continue. But I think the idea that it was a brilliant idea to pull out of these things is very rarely true. It's devastating to pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement. The idea of pulling out of the World Health Organization during a pandemic is really, you know, it's unthinkable, really. You know, Trump was saying originally he would be doing fine if we had 220,000 deaths. You know, we're 100,000 past that now, and we're just hitting the height of it. And you know, that is just unconscionable. I think, you know, Trump was in one sense extremely lucky because very few external threats came along in the first 3 years. And so most of the problems that he had, this is all chronicled in my book, were self-inflicted. When he actually met a real problem from the outside, which is coronavirus, the one obvious thing to do, and you know, Houston's a great medical area, is have a national public health policy. That never happened. And to this day, even vaccine implementation, it's a shocking fact that the HHS said that there would be 1 million people vaccinated a day. And so by the end of the first period, they have, you know, 200 million people vaccinated. They ended the year with 2 million people vaccinated. You know, so it's now putting Biden into a big hole because he has to figure out how to get more people vaccinated. And the question is, are the doses right? Will he invoke the Defense Production Act, et cetera, et cetera? So anyway, but Biden at least has announced a plan and has a competent set of people. I think everything at this point will be very challenging, but I think at least he's got a strategy. You know, something very simple like everybody wears a mask for the first 100 days. That makes perfect sense to me. And, you know, why couldn't you just say something as simple as that many months ago?
You've commented in the media on the point of what the Biden administration might do with regard to COVID-19 and the laws that support or don't support his policies, and with regard to especially the mask mandate. And I believe you commented that there is no legal support for a federal mask mandate, you know, nationwide, other than on federal buildings or on federal land. But is there a way there for Biden to make that mandate effective, you know, across the country?
Yes. So what Biden wants to do is to use his power, legal power, which gives him authority over various enclaves, to set a standard. So, I mean, yeah, like, does anybody doubt that Biden as president would have constitutional authority to order soldiers to wear masks on army bases? You know, they're employees of the United States. He's their commander in chief, and they're on a federal enclave. He couldn't have more power, or in federal territories. Then the question is how you can use those areas where he has legal authority and combine them with areas where there's jawboning and cooperation. And then finally combine it with private mandates. So, you know, universities have been doing a terrific job by and large on this. Hotels, you know, these are private entities who are instituting private mandates globally. And I'm sure a lot of your lawyers who have been advising those clients have been helping on that. But just imagine this scenario, Seepan, you know, somebody gets on a train, subway train in Silver Spring, Maryland, and they're wearing a mask, and they ride it down into the District of Columbia, and they get off the train at Federal Triangle, and they get on the train to Virginia, and then they go out to Virginia, and then they go into private mall, walk through it, and end up at a government building. You know, they're wearing a mask at every step of the way, but they're subject along that simple trip to, you know, a Maryland mandate, a DC mandate, a Virginia mandate, the private mandate in the mall, and the mandate in the government building where they're working as government employees, where obviously the president has power. So that's the way it should work. And, you know, it's, but I think what people are trying to do who want to oppose this is to immediately take it to the outrageous counterexample, like, could I be forced to wear a mask if I'm walking alone in Yellowstone National Park? You know, nobody's talking about that, you know? And, you know, this is why I believe in my freedom. you know, that's where, you know, reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions come in. But I think that to develop this kind of cartoon characterization of these issues and then make it about freedom, when in fact the freedom is people's freedom not to die from coronavirus. I wish we had more of that freedom.
Yeah, and I'll actually take this opportunity to address our members. I forgot to state in the beginning of in the introduction that if you have questions, please do submit them in the chat feature on Zoom, either privately to me or just generally. And I am collecting them, and there have been a few questions so far from folks, and thank you for submitting those, and we'll get to them shortly. I promise to address all the questions and have them fielded by Professor Koh to address. So please do, I do encourage questions, and Professor Koh, when we were planning this event, also encouraged it. So he would look forward to your questions as well. So Professor Koh, I do want to change tracks a bit and talk about international adjudication for a bit. As I mentioned earlier, you're a director on the board of the American Arbitration Association. You have litigated numerous high-profile cases in international courts and tribunals. So how has the United States relationship with international adjudication in the ICJ, ICC, WTO, various arbitral tribunals, how has that relationship shifted under the Trump administration, and how do you see the Biden administration changing course here?
Well, in some areas, it hasn't made that much difference. You know, arbitration largely occurs outside the scope of governmental intervention. And I think, you know, investor state arbitration has been going on much as before, with the exception that everything has moved online because of the pandemic. And online tribunals has been the big innovation. The bottom line there is it works a lot better than people expected. And, you know, I think when everybody's vaccinated and the coronavirus has passed, it'll be difficult to get clients to, you know, if you in Houston want to wake up in the morning and fly to New Orleans for a 3-hour meeting and fly back, you know, the client's not going to want to pay for that next time around. I think the most visible area of, two most visible areas that we'll see some change is the WTO, where, you know, Trump essentially has blocked the appointments to the WTO appellate body, so the dispute settlement body has actually ground to a halt. And that's where I think Biden can move very quickly. You know, the United States has a winning record before the WTO dispute settlement body, and particularly vis-a-vis China. So it's not clear why, you know, Trump literally misstated this over and over again, that this WTO body helps China. I mean, he didn't even look at the statistics there. The other area where I think there's going to be a lot of focus, and especially from people like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, is on consumer arbitration that require class action waivers or confidentiality NDAs on things like sexual harassment and other kinds of things. You know, the Concepcion case upheld the legality under the Federal Arbitration Act of class action waiver procedures. And so there's been a big move, you know, like everybody in the world's cell phone contract. Does anybody read them? You know, this is a classic example of what in first term of law school you learned was an adhesion contract. And I think the Supreme Court is going to have to take this up. But Elizabeth Warren in particular has targeted this issue in her campaign. And I think there'll be a general tendency to try to make, there's a difference between arbitration agreements between two sophisticated business parties. That's Bremen versus Zapata case, which is a Houston case, and you know, arbitration agreements that are impressed on consumers who then have no incentive to bring large cases because they have no class or aggregate litigation capacity.
All right. I think you're doing a great job of providing me with segues into my next question, Professor Koh. So
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do here.
you're mentioning the WTO and our record against China in particular in the WTO. And I did want to ask you about international trade, which is a critical component of the Houston economy. The Port of Houston is the #1 port in the U.S. in terms of both waterborne and foreign tonnage. And the Houston Ship Channel is the busiest waterway in the nation. And of course, within that context, an important trading partner for Houston is China. And under the Trump administration, we've seen the United States go to war with China on trade. And that led to the closing of the Chinese consulate in Houston. So Houston saw the immediate effects of that. And during the pandemic, we also saw efforts to sue the sovereign state of China for starting the pandemic, allegedly. And so more recently, the U.S. stood by as 14 Asian Pacific countries led by China signed the largest trade agreement in the world, which is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And I believe, the precursor to that would have been perhaps the TPP, but, as you said earlier, Trump pulled out of that. And so we were on the sidelines when this agreement was put into place. So how do you now assess where we are with the U.S.-China relationship under Trump, and how do you see the China relationship evolving under Biden?
Well, this is an area where China has made dramatic progress from their own perspective. When I first went to the U.S. government, Seepan, in 1998, I went to a meeting of senior Chinese officials whose focus was on U.S. affairs. And there were 5 people in particular, all of whom spoke fluent, I could name them, all of them who spoke fluent English. When I went back in 2009, they were still there. And recently I saw a picture between Trump meeting with Xi Jinping, and they were there too. These guys know everything about America. They see us as an adversary. They have a disciplined and coordinated strategy. So one of the things they've been doing is they've been filling vacuums. And now they're actually, with Belt and Road and their new investment bank initiative, trying to create alternative institutions to the Bretton Woods institutions. And they play on the ego of people like Trump, who believe that they don't need to know anything about this history, or who believe that the solution for everything is unilateral tariffs. Biden is extremely experienced in dealing with the Chinese. We're lucky about that. Biden was in Senate for 46 years. I think he was in the Foreign Relations Committee for probably 30 years. He met with the Chinese directly in the Obama administration on occasion after occasion. And I think they're going to have to meet and discuss. The basic principles were always China should be part of the international system, but play by the international rules. And we were getting some progress because China was trying to enter the WTO, so was more willing to try to play by WTO rules, while very firmly staying out of the human rights system. The law of the sea is a good area where the South China Sea arbitration, which didn't have jurisdiction, and China didn't show up, it was still a huge victory for the Philippines in terms of rejecting China's theory of the 9-dash line. So this is one of those areas, law of the sea, which the Republican opposition to this is totally counterproductive. We are in a picture where, the United States, I've litigated a number of cases now under the law of the sea, both at the tribunal and at the Permanent Court of Arbitration. That's where people are bringing issues now, public international law issues. The United States is not there. And, the politicians who say they're worried about our sovereignty, well, guess what? You're so interested in protecting our sovereignty, you're surrendering the South China Sea to the Chinese and the Arctic to the Russians. They're supposed to be the people you're most concerned about. The United States follows most of the law of the sea convention rules as a matter of customary international law, we just don't get the benefit of the dispute resolution provisions. So, and it turns out that, the last 6 or 7 secretaries of state and defense, the last 6 or 7 heads of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all the secretaries of the Navy, without regard to political affiliation, think we should be going back and we should be going to the Law of the Sea Convention. But it takes 2/3, and whether you can get to a 2/3 with this Senate is a big question.
Okay. And I think I do want to spend a little bit of time on human rights issues in China, especially because I know that in 2012, especially there was a high-profile incident where you assisted the blind Chinese lawyer and civil rights activist Chen Guangcheng in securing medical treatment and the right to travel out of China. And he then pursued legal studies in the U.S. And at that time, you were legal advisor to the State Department. And so, where do you see, do you think the Biden administration is going to re-emphasize human rights in its relationship with China? And where do you see that as being, do you see that being a conflict point in the relationship between the two countries?
Yeah, it will be, but I think that the main lesson, Seepan, of that incident was that when I was doing that, I was in the embassy, our embassy in Beijing, with this blind Chinese activist who had come into the embassy seeking asylum. And there was a question of, because the United States at that moment, Hillary Clinton, Tim Geithner, and 250 US officials were over in Beijing for the strategic and economic dialogue. That showed that there were dozens of points that were non-zero sum. And in the various meetings, my point was very simple. The Chinese have a lot invested in this relationship with us. They're not going to blow it up over one guy. And so if we can figure out a way that we can let them save face, because that's what they care about, we can do the right thing. And that's what happened. And so we actually got him to, this is where globalization helps us. NYU is starting a global campus in Shanghai. We got him to NYU Shanghai, and then he switched over to NYU New York and came in under the protections of the private network, the private global network. And I think this is particularly true today, that the United States can push a lot harder on human rights and not jeopardize the relationship. The Chinese certainly have no difficulty pushing us on their issues. Arguably a genocide is going on against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province.
Right.
And, the United States is not a country that should be sitting by while genocidal acts are being carried out and being told that they don't matter. Or look at Tibet, where they're essentially waiting out the Dalai Lama. But I think Biden is excellent on these issues and will push hard on it. And, this is not an alliance. But the United States can certainly say, we care about our values and we're not going to back down on them because you need us as much as we need you. I think the primary area of cooperation at the beginning is climate change, because it was the US and China under Obama that got us to the Paris Climate Agreement. And China very much welcomes collaboration with US on climate issues. And I think, John Kerry is now the special envoy. He's got a lot of experience, and I think he's going to do a great job in kind of reinitiating that, reengaging on that.
Okay. So I'll end with this question, and we have a ton more that we could go through, and it's already been a wide-ranging discussion, which I appreciate, Professor Koh. And then I do want to get to our questions from our members with the time that we do have left. So looking forward, Professor Koh, pundits have discussed whether the Biden administration will just become Obama version 2.0, or whether it might want to chart a new course forward for itself. Do you see the Biden administration attempting to restore a pre-Trump status quo? Or if not, how do you think the Biden administration will proceed and what its priorities will be?
Well, that's not enough. Getting back to the status quo ante in a damaged world is not enough. I would say that the Biden administration should focus on 5 R's. First, reaffirm our values. Second, reverse the most egregious Trump policies, family separation, the wall, travel ban, Guantanamo. Third, rebuild. You have to rebuild the foreign service and the civil service, and which has been badly damaged. Fourth, re-engage on all kinds of different fronts. New START agreement, Human Rights Council, stop sanctioning officials from the International Criminal Court. What's the point of that? The World Health Organization, as we mentioned, Paris Climate Agreement. But I think most fundamentally, fifth, is reconceptualizing exactly what we're doing. And I think we have to see this as an opportunity to refresh the multilateral institutions of the post-World War II era. In the cases where there's been disengagement, use the moment of re-engagement to try to lobby for changes. And also to make a much stronger connection between what's going on overseas and what's going on domestically. This has been a central part of Biden's initiative, is that our foreign policy has to be seen as serving the American middle class, not screwing the American middle class. And Biden made an important pledge that hasn't gotten enough attention, that he would hold a democracy summit in the first year that would focus on three things: anti-authoritarianism, anti-corruption, and advancing the rule of law. And on the anti-corruption piece, there's huge benefits for the US business community, which is, getting to agreed rules of transparency, eliminate some of the most obvious tax havens, prevent various forms of money laundering, or that allow this kind of self-dealing. The real question for Trump ought to have been, where did he get his money? At a certain point, he stopped being a good credit risk, but nevertheless, money flowed to him through oligarchs or other means. And that will be part of the investigation of this. So I think that the answer to your question, Seepan, is reaffirm values and reverse bad policies are what gets you back to the status quo ante, but then rebuild, re-engage, and reconceptualize are critical next steps. Now, that might take 2 terms to do it. And let's hope that Biden can hold, and Harris can hold the community together. I've written an op-ed piece that appeared in a bunch of places, the Japan Times. It just appeared in Bogota newspaper. So if you want to send that around, it lays this out a little bit more systematically.
Sure, absolutely. So in coming to our members' questions now, we have one question which has a few parts to it. So I'll start with part number 1. If you could give us your perspective, Professor Koh, on President Trump's 11th hour foreign policy decision to name Cuba as a sponsor of terrorism.
Well, I mean, what is that all about? I mean, it's an effort to pander to a very small electoral faction. I mean, he lost Florida, and so I think he wants to appeal to that. We've had a sanctions policy, unilateral sanctions policy on Cuba that goes back to 1959. Now, that's 60 years. It didn't work. And there was a re-engagement strategy. I represented Cuban refugees for 2 years. And my parents stayed away from the communist regime. I have no interest in the government of Castro and successors. But you're going to engage with North Korea and China, and you're not going to engage with Cuba? I mean, what is the point of that? And I think Biden will, that's just another thing for Biden to unwind. It's just such an 11th hour thing. And, so one thing that the Trump administration has been very active, and therefore you're gonna have to do a lot to undo the damage. Same goes for Helms-Burton, which I think will be a big issue. A lot of this will really be about enraging our allies, who will be the targets of these secondary sanctions.
Right. Okay. And then similarly, your views on a possible reset with North Korea under the Biden administration, given Trump's unique relationship, let's put it that way, with Kim Jong-un.
Well, I went with Madeleine Albright to Pyongyang in 2000 for 5 days.
Right.
I'm a Korean American. There was a deal to be made there that George W. Bush walked away from, but the level of mishandling by Trump himself, if we had one rule, you never, the president of the United States never negotiates with a tin pot dictator like Kim Jong-un without them satisfying 10 preconditions, release a whole bunch of political prisoners, stop making threats, show us progress on dismantling nuclear facilities, greater transparency, let UN inspectors in. The idea that our president was so eager for a deal that he would repeatedly appear with and elevate a guy who's one of the worst human violators in the world. Remember that Trump was very worked up about Otto Warmbier, the young guy from the University of Virginia, who captured and died in captivity. Then once he got a meeting with Kim Jong-un, he says, I love him. And by the way, Kim Jong-un was very careful to say things that Trump took in the most optimistic form and that he didn't necessarily violate them. He just used, as we lawyers all do, the loopholes he put into his original statement to say he was obeying his original commitments. Finally, there's absolutely no way that you engage bilaterally with North Korea without looping in South Korea and the Japanese and, essentially having China at the table because they're the ones who the North Koreans listen to, and the EU. And so the idea that Trump thought that, he could accomplish this by his unilateral high-level diplomacy, it's like bringing in your closer in the first inning. I could go on and on about the stupidity of the policy. But, obviously, Wendy Sherman has just been named Secretary of Defense. She's first rate. I've worked with her multiple times. She was with us on the original trip to Pyongyang in 2000. She knows all the players. She's extremely adept. She won't make these mistakes. And Kurt Campbell has just been named the top East Asia guy at the National Security Council. He knows this stuff cold. And so this is where what people are calling Obama 2.0 is actually meaning you can bring in people who are not amateurs and who don't have to start at square one trying to figure out what's going on.
Right. Okay. And with that, I'll end on this question, Professor Koh, as we near the end of our time. Looking forward, what emerging threats to our national security as well as to international security do you see for which there is a lack of an adequate legal framework to manage or resolve? What keeps you up at night when it comes to an inadequate legal framework?
Oh, no question, cybersecurity. You were nice to ask about the Oxford process. All three were about cybersecurity. And, we were trying very simply to declare no-fly zones for cyber activity. Like there is no justification for interfering with the healthcare sector during the pandemic with computer signals. There's no justification. There's absolutely no justification for screwing around with vaccine research. And there's no justification for manipulating or screwing up election interference. But, you guys in Texas with solar winds in Austin have just had FireEye. It turns out that we've had the Russian GRU and the SK, I forget their acronym, have just, they had a regular backdoor in to many different agencies, and it's a massive security breach. Now, the interesting thing is they are calling this just espionage, and therefore it doesn't violate international law. But my view is it's actually espionage plus. It's espionage plus calling into question the integrity of the system. And arguably is part of screwing around with what a protected per se entity, which is called the critical infrastructure of the internet. And my view is there ought to be stated norms about, we ought to be able to agree that what the Russians have done is illegal under international law, not just accepted espionage. Now, when you start to put these different things together, no-fly zones, protected spaces, forbidden activities, then you're starting to have what looks like a treaty. And I think Biden can start by running that with the NATO countries, working with the big tech companies who have every interest in having there be government-to-government rules that protect them. It's a new field and it's a big field. So it's always something that you don't think, everybody thought at the beginning of the Obama administration, the issue would be detention. In fact, it was drones. And now, it turns out people are much less agitated about counterterrorism, even though 3,000 people got killed on 9/11, because 350,000 people have been killed by coronavirus. So it turns out that our greatest need now is global public health. So I think that's, those two areas, cybersecurity and global public health, ought to be our, and climate change ought to be our three top priorities for international lawmaking.
And on that note, Professor Koh, I want to thank you for your time today on a lot of different topics that we addressed and covered. I know that on behalf of our section that we all appreciate your time and thank you for joining us. And to our members, I will circulate the article that Professor Koh mentioned. And also send an Amazon link to the book that Professor Koh wrote in 2018.
Oh, yeah. I have to tell you, Seepan, that when I told my family this morning, hey, I'm going to be on a call with Houston, they said, why? Do we have a problem?
The joke had to be made.
Anyway, it was great to be on. Great to see you.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.
Thanks for doing this.
Take care.
Great.
Thank you. Take care now.